Hi everyone, this is Peter Beal. I'm going to do a quick talk on the nature of Cubism, important art movement that shows up around the end of the first decade of the 20th century. It's particularly important, I think, in terms of discussing the emergence of the avant-garde, even perhaps more so than the foes of the expressionists. I'm going to say that because of the profoundly intellectual nature of Cubist art, that it really probably more than anything that we would look at in Western art, maybe up to the 15th century, we look at the ways in which linear perspective and the ways of constructing a painting were, first really seriously theorized. In Cubism, we see a pretty thorough, methodical working out of a counter to that way of looking at the world, and representing the world in terms of depth and space, and the idea of a kind of fictive reality behind the picture plane. So Cubism is a pretty profound departure, and typically seen, especially in an introductory study like this, as a good marker for the emergence of a cultural movement known as modernism. So it's probably going to be worth spending a little bit of time, kind of figuring this out. And we may turn this into two videos. We'll see. But anyway, so let's move on to our first piece to get the story started. So if we go, and actually I think it's being remodeled right now, so sorry to date this video, but the Museum of Modern Art is being worked on in New York. But if we went there, we could go view this painting by the very well-known, mostly working in the 20th century, Spanish artist Pablo Picasso, and his painting titled Les Demoiselles dAvignon from 1907. It's a pretty big piece, and because of that, I think any viewer at the time, and an aware viewer today would kind of pick up on this as well. Because of its size, it trades upon, and as we'll see the subject matter, trades upon some of the conventional expectations of serious oil painting. So it's, 8 by roughly 7.5 feet tall and across. So its dimensions are substantial. The subject matter is one that by now in Western art has a long and hallowed presence, and that is a painting, a figural group of nude women. This is something that would typically, I think, in Picasso's time, be cast under a kind of classical guise, especially, or possibly, besides classical, I should add, also Oriental or Orientalist, as might be the term that's used. In other words, the proverbial exotic Mideast harem type of situation. So there's a place for it in academic art, for a figural grouping of women, draped to a greater or lesser extent. However, and this kind of echoes, but in a much more confrontational way, echoes some of the things that we would have seen with Edouard Manet. It echoes Manet, but really goes well beyond it in undermining the assumptions that would go into a large figural group in an oil painting. For starters, one of the things, and this kind of echoes Manet's Olympia, the very phrase Les Demoiselles dAvignon is a title that refers to prostitution. So these are not, based on the title, leisured, elegant ladies of ancient Rome, or, languid women of the Sultan's harem and that kind of thing. So there's definitely an echo of Manet's famous portrait of the prostitute. Again, her name Olympia is a common sort of pseudonym for a sex worker at the time. And the phrase the Demoiselles dAvignon has the same kind of connotation. So that would have probably, upset or disturbed a fair number of viewers right from the get-go. But it's really the sort of formal qualities of the piece that are going to prove to be particularly upsetting to any viewer who's tuned into traditions that I've talked about before. That is to say, the large figural group in oil paint, academic nudes, etc. Yeah, somebody like Bouguereau would be another good example with his nymphs and satyrs. So what's going on here? Well, for starters, despite the traditional subject matter, Picasso's gone to considerable lengths to erase any sort of pretense that the viewer is looking at a kind of plausible, naturalistic, let alone realistic depiction of the scene. So in essence, the entire picture is composed of flat planes of color. It's almost impossible to find anything that resembles, in any proper sense of the term, modeling. So we'll just take the upper arm of this figure right here. There's no sense of suggesting highlighting or shadowing to give any kind of three-dimensional mass to, to her. And if you look throughout the entire piece, that is for the most part the case. There's a little bit of a sense of modeling here, perhaps, but that's kind of foreclosed upon by the fact that this much more clearly represents a mask. Same thing here. A human construction, itself an artificial face. We'll go more into the mask in a second. So it's very, very flat. Furthermore, the outlines that we're presented with, and some of them are almost caricaturishly broad, like a kind of cartoon drawing. The outlines, such as they are often angular and violently erratic. Again, a human body, an organic human body, is not going to have this sense of sharp and distinct separation or angles. So there's a combination, again, of flat planes, jagged angles, strong reliance on these artificial outlines, barely contour lines. For instance, this figure's right breast. The sense of this is just simplified and exaggerated even. So basically, it's literally breaking up the scene in front of us. In the foreground is another nod to another traditional topic in Western art, the still life. And so it looks like there's perhaps a bunch of grapes, maybe an apple here. I can't even figure out what fruit this actually would be. Perhaps a slice of melon or something. But again, the disinclination on the part of Picasso to transform any of that into something more believable in terms of volume or mass, taking up space, that kind of thing, light behaving naturally in any of it, that's all gone. Again, kind of echoing Manet, the women in the picture confront the viewer. And again, it's hard for us to understand today, and not to say that women's rights issues are by any means solved, or that women are really on equal standing in the art world or any other world for that matter. But it certainly would have been profoundly jarring for a spectator to be confronted by these women who are, again, not demure and kind of modest about their nudity, but are really quite straightforward about it, confronting the viewer with these open and direct and kind of blank expressions. So that's, again, very much against expectations and conventions of the time. Again, an echo perhaps of the females that Edouard Manet paints in his Déjeuner or in the Olympia. Another element that's brought to bear, besides the other factors that we've already mentioned, are precisely these masks that cover the heads of the two figures on the right of the painting. And these are very much the byproduct of Pablo Picasso's interest in African art. This itself is a kind of interesting and controversial topic for art historians. Some art historians, for instance, will shy away from using I think it's still hanging in there, but I think increasingly frowned upon, a movement in art known as primitivism. Primitivism is essentially the idea that artists latched onto works of art. At the time, they may well have been seen more in an anthropological aspect, but works of art from various far-flung and oftentimes colonial regions of the world. So in the case of France, France has colonial possessions in Africa. And in a number of cases, these territories are sending art or having their art sent. That's another interesting chapter in art history, the idea of appropriation and perhaps outright theft in the era of colonialism. But in any case, these works of art are being displayed in various shows, exhibitions, coming into new museums of anthropology and natural history. This is a kind of interesting thing, whether or not at the time people looked at non-Western peoples as perhaps a little bit more like animals than actual humans, and hence they belong in natural history museums, not in actual art museums. Regardless, Pablo Picasso seems to be fascinated by the expressive capacity of these works of art, and particularly suited to somebody who's working in the figural tradition, as Picasso did his entire life. Particularly the ways in which these anonymous, sadly, it'd be great to know who these people were and more about them, the way these anonymous artists transformed the human face, or the human body, depending on which works of art you're looking at. So the reliance on broad, straightforward forms dominated by planes and angles, the sense of moving much more towards abstraction, emphasizing stark and dramatic forms, expressions that, at least in the eyes of viewers, say around 1907, were very alien and off-putting and strange, and of course carrying with them the aura, of pre-civilized or uncivilized or whatever kinds of adjectives you care to use. Art from the jungle, the desert, places that weren't cultured, certainly not like Paris. So when you look at the Demoiselles, you're seeing a really quite dramatic intersection of a lot of problematic features in a painting all at once. Now, for our purposes, besides a kind of general introduction to some of the themes in modernism, again, the sense of confronting a viewer with a radical revision of a conventional mode of presenting art, we want to kind of dive in to the ways in which Picasso has kind of, it's a little bit jargony word, but interrogated the assumptions of those conventional assumptions of Western art. And again, the primary themes that emerge right away, besides the aspect of the masks or the, frank and somewhat aggressive nature of the women involved, is that reduction of the painting to a kind of series of overlapping pictorial, semi-overlapping, juxtaposed pictorial planes. And this is the kind of thing that in just a few years, especially with the meeting of Georges Braque and Picasso, will be transformed into the art movement. A not terribly long-lived, but very influential art movement known as Cubism. So this is a good picture to, both in terms of its time, its subject matter, its presentation, to begin to think about the major issues of modern art in Europe and then eventually the Americas in the first half of the 20th century. In the next lecture, we'll go a little bit more into specifics with regard to Cubism, looking at some pieces that are perhaps more exclusively Cubist. And so let's stay tuned for that.